The sun was still climbing, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured grounds of the Lockwood Military Academy. It was a place of crisp lines, polished brass, and an almost tangible silence broken only by the rhythmic cadence of marching boots. Into this ordered world came a woman named Eleanor. She felt the change in atmosphere the moment her car passed the guarded gate. The air itself seemed different, stiller, charged with a quiet purpose. She was not in her element. Her world was one of soft library lighting, the whisper of turning pages, and the faint, dusty smell of old paper. Today, she wore simple, comfortable clothes, a cream-colored blouse and dark trousers. Practical for a long day of work, but here they made her feel like a bright, unscripted blot on a page of gray uniform code. Her destination was the Thornton Memorial Library, a grand stone building that looked more like a cathedral to discipline than a house of knowledge. Her heart beat a little faster as she approached the heavy oak doors. She was here on a prestigious month-long residency. A private foundation had acquired a cache of personal letters from General Asa Lockwood, the Academy's fierce founding father, and her job was to catalog, preserve, and start to piece together the real story they contained. It was a historian's dream. Inside, the silence deepened. A young cadet at the front desk, looking barely out of his teens, nodded stiffly and directed her to the secured West Wing. "Archives are on the 3rd floor, ma'am. Sergeant Major Royce is expecting you." The name meant nothing to her then. The stairs seemed to grow colder as she climbed. The 3rd-floor hallway was a stark, linoleum-tiled space, lit by harsh fluorescent lights. At the end of it stood a man. He was not a large man, but he seemed to fill the corridor. His uniform was so immaculate, it looked carved from stone. His back was rod-straight, and his hands were clasped tightly behind him. As Eleanor approached, his eyes, a pale, flinty gray, tracked her with the unmoving intensity of a security camera. He did not smile. "Can I help you?" His voice was low, gravelly, and it wasn't really a question. It was a challenge. "Good morning," Eleanor said, offering a small, polite smile. "I'm Dr. Vance, the civilian archivist. I have an appointment to access the Lockwood collection." The man, Sergeant Major Royce, did not budge. He looked her up and down, a slow, deliberate scan that took in her civilian shoes, her trousers, her bag slung over her shoulder. His gaze lingered on her face, as if searching for a rank insignia that wasn't there. "Credentials," he stated. The word flat and final. Eleanor fumbled in her bag, her fingers suddenly clumsy under his stare. She produced a folder containing her letter of authorization from the Foundation, her photo ID, and the clearance paperwork the Academy had processed. She held them out. He took them as if they might be contaminated. He didn't just read them. He inspected them. He held the ID photo up, comparing it to her face with a skepticism usually reserved for counterfeit currency. He traced the lines of the signatures with a thick finger. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of the building. "This says you have Level 2 access," he said, finally looking up. His tone implied Level 2 access was a privilege usually reserved for visiting royalty. Not a woman in a cream blouse. "Yes, that's what I was told," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice even. He sighed, a short, sharp exhale through his nose. "Level 2 gets you into the archive room. It does not grant you unsupervised loitering in secure hallways. It does not mean you can wander. I have no intention of wandering, Sergeant Major. I was directed here." He ignored this. The archive room is a working facility, not a reading lounge. He said the last 2 words with clear distaste. "You will sign the logbook here every time you enter and exit. You will not remove any material from this hallway. You will not touch anything that is not part of your specified collection. Is that understood?" Eleanor felt a flush of warmth creep up her neck. She was 51 years old, held a Ph.D., and had managed delicate archival projects in far less forgiving institutions than this. But under his gaze, she felt like a misbehaving schoolgirl. "Perfectly understood," she said, her own voice cooling a few degrees. He gave one last, slow nod, as if reluctantly granting a parole. He produced a heavy ring of keys, selected one, and unlocked a solid metal door beside him. It opened with a low groan. The room beyond was dark. He reached in and flicked a switch, revealing a small, windowless space dominated by a large steel table. A single banker's box sat in the center of it, under a pool of light from a solitary lamp. "Your material," he said, stepping aside just enough to let her pass. "The logbook is on the wall. Sign in." Eleanor walked past him, catching a faint scent of starch and old tobacco. She went to the logbook, a clipboard with a typed sheet, and wrote her name, the time, and the date in clear, looping handwriting. When she turned around, he was still standing in the doorway, a dark silhouette blocking the light from the hall. The door must remain closed and locked at all times for security. "I'll be in the vicinity. If you need to leave for any reason, the restroom, a phone call, you find me first to secure the room. We don't leave sensitive material unattended with. Civilian personnel in the building." He paused, letting the final phrase hang in the air. It was more than a procedure. It was a label. A civilian. An outsider. An interloper in his world of order and rules. He looked at her for one more second, his expression unreadable, then stepped back and pulled the heavy door shut with a decisive clunk. The sound echoed in the small room. Eleanor was alone. She stood still for a moment, listening to the retreating tap of his polished boots on the linoleum outside. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The room felt suddenly very quiet, very still, and very cold. She looked at the plain banker's box on the table. Inside were the voices of the past, waiting for her. And outside the door, she now knew, stood a very present and very unfriendly obstacle. She pulled out her chair, sat down, and carefully lifted the lid off the box. The work, at least, would not judge her. The next morning, Eleanor arrived determined. She had a system. She brought her own reading lamp for extra light, a pair of soft white cotton gloves to handle the brittle paper, and a notebook with pages she had already numbered and organized. She was a professional, and she would act like one, no matter how uncomfortable the guard at the gate made her feel. But Sergeant Major Royce had a system too. His was based on a deep belief that his hallway, his archive, had been perfectly orderly until this civilian disturbance arrived. And his job was to manage that disturbance. It started small. The day before, he had told her he would leave the security door to the archive room, propped open with a rubber wedge during work hours, so she could come and go to the restroom or the water fountain without having to find him every single time. It was a small courtesy, a logical adjustment. On this second day, the wedge was gone. Eleanor stood before the closed, heavy door. She knocked softly. No answer. She waited a full 5 minutes, her bag getting heavier on her shoulder. Finally, she heard the sharp steps. Royce appeared from a side office, a stack of files in his hand, looking purposefully busy. "You need something?" he asked, as if he hadn't expected her. "The door," she said, trying to keep any irritation out of her voice. "It's locked. I thought it would be propped open." "Security regulation," he said flatly, not meeting her eyes as he shifted the files. "Doors in the secure wing must remain closed and locked." "I thought I made that clear yesterday." He unlocked the door, holding it open just wide enough for her to slip through. "If you need to leave the room, you'll need to secure it first. Find me." The pattern was set. Every trip to the restroom became a small expedition. She would have to pack up her workspace, place every letter back into its protective sleeve and into the box, close the lid, and only then step into the hall to search for him. Sometimes he was at the desk at the end of the hall. Often he was not. She would wait, feeling like a ghost in the silent corridor, until he would appear, always with some minor task in hand. "Ah, there you are," he'd say, though she was the one who had been waiting. The noise started on the third day. A maintenance crew arrived to work on the air conditioning unit directly outside the archive room door. The noise was tremendous, a crashing, drilling, banging symphony. Eleanor tried to focus on General Lockwood's spidery handwriting, but the vibrations made the table tremble. It went on for 2 hours. When the crew packed up, Royce was there, overseeing. "Apologies for the disruption," he said, though his tone wasn't apologetic. "Essential systems maintenance. Can't be helped." She simply nodded, her ears ringing in the sudden quiet. The worst, however, were the lessons. Royce seemed to have taken it upon himself to use her presence as a training opportunity for the young cadets, who occasionally passed through the wing. He would stop them in the hallway, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry through the thick door. "Remember, operational security is a 24-hour duty. It doesn't matter who is in the building or what their business is. You maintain protocol at all times. Is that clear?" The cadets would chorus, "Yes, Sergeant Major." Eleanor would sit perfectly still at her table, her cheeks burning. She wasn't being accused of anything specific, but she felt accused all the same. She was the unnamed example, the whoever in his wording. She was the potential Bree. She began to develop a quiet radar for him. She learned the sound of his specific footsteps, a firm, unhurried tap-tap-tap that was different from the quicker, lighter steps of the cadets. She could sense when he was lingering outside the door, a dark presence just on the other side of the metal. It was a strange, oppressive feeling, being so intently watched in a room by yourself. A friend from home called her one evening. "So, how's the military fantasy camp?" They joked. Eleanor let out a short, tired laugh. "It's regimented. The material is fascinating. The atmosphere is cold. Are they giving you a hard time?" She thought about it. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't said anything explicitly cruel. It was all procedure, all regulation, all delivered with a stone-faced correctness. "It's just a bit tense," she said finally, not wanting to give the petty annoyances more power by speaking them aloud. "There's one fellow who seems to think I'm a spy who's come to steal the secret of how to polish boots." But alone in her quiet rented room, the feeling lingered. It was the feeling of being unwelcome, of being a problem to be managed. It grated on her, not because she was fragile, but because she was proud of her work. She was good at it. And here, her expertise seemed to mean nothing next to the fact that her clothes were the wrong color. She started a new section in her notebook. Not for General Lockwood's letters, but for her own records. At the end of each day, in neat, factual handwriting, she would note the time she arrived, the time she was let in, the duration of any delays, and the nature of any disruptions. She didn't do it because she planned to complain. She did it because she was a historian. She documented facts. And the fact was, she was being hassled. Writing it down somehow made it feel less personal, more like a social study. It was her way of staying calm, of staying above it. She focused on the letters. In them, General Lockwood complained about bureaucratic meddlers from Washington, soft men in fine suits who didn't understand the reality of command. The irony was not lost on Eleanor. She felt a strange, distant kinship with the old general. They were both, in their own ways, dealing with people who were certain they didn't belong. She would take a deep breath, adjust her cotton gloves, and dive back into the past. The present, with its locked doors and loud lessons, could wait outside. For a few hours at a time, surrounded by the whispers of history, she could almost pretend it didn't exist. Almost. The following week settled into a grim kind of routine. Eleanor felt less like a visiting scholar and more like a tolerated piece of furniture that kept needing to be moved and dusted around. Her world had shrunk to the small, airless room, the contents of the box, and the sound of Sergeant Major Royce's footsteps. She became an expert in efficiency. She timed her trips to the water fountain for mid-morning, when he was often at his desk doing paperwork. She brought a large thermos of tea to limit her need to leave at all. She moved with a quiet, precise economy, her focus entirely on the fragile pages before her. She was building a wall of professionalism, brick by brick. To keep the annoyance out, the letters were revealing a new side of General Lockwood. Beyond the bluster, she found passages of surprising doubt, letters to his sister, where he worried about the young men under his command, about the weight of his decisions. It was compelling work, and it helped to lose herself in it. Then, on a Thursday, the atmosphere shifted. Something was happening in the wider academy. There were more officers in pressed uniforms moving through the halls, a feeling of heightened alertness. Eleanor overheard two cadets talking about inspection or a VIP tour. For Sergeant Major Royce, this seemed to dial his vigilance up to its highest pitch. His eyes, when they fell on her, held a new level of simmering tension. She was not just a civilian. She was now a civilian variable during an important event. A potential embarrassment. The incident happened just after lunch. Eleanor had stepped out to use the restroom. Following the now ingrained ritual, she had carefully packed everything away, closed the box, and gone to find Royce. He was at his desk, speaking in a low, urgent voice on the phone. He saw her, held up a single finger, and turned his chair slightly away. She waited. 5 minutes passed. He was still talking. Feeling a growing urgency, she decided to take a chance. The room was secure. The box was closed. She would be 2 minutes. No more. She hurried down the hall. When she returned, less than 3 minutes later, Royce was standing directly in front of the archive room door, his arms crossed. His face was like a storm cloud. "Where were you?" His voice was low and tight. "I went to the restroom. I waited, but you were on a call. You left a secure room unsecured." He stated it as an absolute fact. A crime already proven. "It is secure," she said, a flush of defiance finally breaking through her calm. "The material is stored. The door is locked. I was gone for 2 minutes." He didn't seem to hear her. His gaze swept past her, down the hall. His eyes narrowed. A small wheeled cart, used by the cleaning staff, was parked against the wall, a few doors down. On its top shelf was a slim, dark blue binder. Where did that come from? He asked, more to himself than to her. He strode over to it, flipping it open. His head snapped up, and when he looked at her, his expression was a mixture of triumph and fury. "This is a classified logistics roster. It was not on this cart this morning." Eleanor felt a cold dread. "I have no idea. I didn't touch it." "Of course you didn't," he said, his voice dripping with a sarcasm so heavy it was almost tangible. He walked back toward her, holding the binder like evidence. "It just appeared. You just happened to be out of the room, unsupervised, and this happened to be right here. A coincidence. Sergeant Major, I did not take that binder. I've been in the archive room all day. You know that, do I?" He shot back. His control was slipping, his voice rising enough to echo in the linoleum-lined space. "My job is to protect sensitive material, and I have a civilian repeatedly requiring exceptions to protocol, now found in a hallway where classified documents had been left unattended. What am I supposed to think? His words were loud now, sharp. Doors down the hall cracked open. The curious, anxious faces of two young cadets appeared, then quickly disappeared. Eleanor was burning with a mixture of rage and humiliation. She was being publicly accused of being a thief, or a spy, or just a reckless fool. Right there in the hallway. "Empty your bag," Royce ordered, pointing to the satchel on her shoulder. That was the final straw. The cool, professional wall she had built crumbled. Her own voice came out quiet, but steel hard. "No." His eyes widened slightly. "What?" I said no. "You have no authority to search my personal property. You have seen me follow every one of your rules, even the pointless ones. I have signed your logbook 100 times. I have tolerated your disruptions and your implications. But I will not be strip-searched in a hallway because you misplaced a file." The word "misplaced" hit him like a slap. For a second, he was speechless, his jaw working. "Your disrespect for protocol is exactly the problem." He finally burst out, his finger jabbing toward the archive room door. "This is not some public library. This is a military installation. You people waltz in here with your clearances and your academic titles, and you think the rules don't apply to you. Well, they do." The hallway had gone utterly silent. The air was thick with the confrontation. Eleanor stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was about to speak, to say something she knew she might regret, when a movement at the far end of the corridor caught her eye. A man was standing there, watching. He was older, with short, silvering hair, and he wore the uniform of a full colonel. He had clearly been there for some time. He was not smiling. His expression was unreadable, a mask of calm observation. His eyes met Eleanor's for the briefest moment, then flicked to the furious sergeant major, and then to the blue binder in his hand, Colonel David Griffin. The commander of training had seen and heard everything. He did not approach. He did not say a word. He simply held the scene in his gaze for another few seconds. Then he turned on his heel with a crisp, silent pivot and walked away, his own footsteps silent on the carpet of his office doorway further down the hall. The silence he left behind was even heavier. Royce had seen him too. All the color drained from the sergeant major's face, replaced by a sickly pale hue. His bluster vanished, swallowed by a sudden, gaping fear. The colonel had witnessed his outburst, his loss of control. Eleanor felt no victory, only a hollow exhaustion. Without another word, she turned, took out her key, unlocked the archive room door, and went inside. She closed the door softly behind her, leaning against it for a moment in the dark. Outside, she heard nothing. No footsteps, no more angry words. Just a long, profound, and terrible silence. The war in the hallway was over, for now. But she had no idea what peace or what new storm the colonel's silent witness might bring. The silence in the archive room was absolute. Eleanor stood with her back against the cool metal door, her heart still thudding from the confrontation. The harsh fluorescent light buzzed overhead, a sound she usually tuned out, but which now felt deafening. She took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady herself. The look on the colonel's face as he watched from the end of the hall played over and over in her mind. It wasn't anger. It was something worse, cold, clear observation. She made herself walk to the table and sit down. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the box and took out the next letter. But the words of General Lockwood blurred on the page. All she could see was Sergeant Major Royce's furious face, the accusatory finger, the blue binder. The public shame of it burned in her chest. For the first time, she considered packing her things and leaving. This project wasn't worth this kind of humiliation, but something stubborn within her refused. She hadn't done anything wrong. Leaving would feel like letting him win, like admitting he was right about her. So she stayed, staring at the letter without seeing it, until the clock told her it was a respectable time to leave. The next morning, a Friday, felt different. The air in the secure wing was still, almost waiting. Sergeant Major Royce was at his desk when she arrived. He didn't look at her. He simply stood, walked to the archive room door, unlocked it, and held it open, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall above her head. He looked like a man awaiting sentencing. Not a word passed between them. Eleanor worked in a bubble of quiet anxiety. What happened now? Would she be summoned to some office, reprimanded for her part in the conflict? Would her access be revoked? The waiting was its own kind of torture. Just before 11 o'clock, the answer came. A young cadet, looking terribly serious, appeared in her open doorway. "Ma'am?" he said, his voice formal. "Colonel Griffin's compliments. You are requested to join him in the command suite at your earliest convenience." At your earliest convenience. The polite military phrasing did nothing to calm her nerves. This was a summons. "Thank you," she said, her voice surprisingly even. "I'll come now." She carefully put away the letter she was working on, closed the box, and followed the cadet out. Royce was standing by his desk, watching her go. His face was unreadable, but the usual rigid confidence was gone. He looked, for the first time, uncertain. The command suite was in a different building, one with carpets and oil paintings of past generals on the walls. The air smelled of wood polish and old books. The cadet led her to a heavy oak door, knocked once, and opened it. "Dr. Vance." "Sir," the cadet announced, and then stepped back, leaving her there. The room was spacious, with large windows overlooking the parade ground. Colonel David Griffin stood behind a wide, polished desk, not sitting. He was in his formal uniform, and the morning light glinted off the eagles on his collar. His expression was professional, neutral. Standing stiffly to the side, like a statue at attention, was Sergeant Major Royce. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle twitched in his cheek. "Dr. Vance." "Thank you for coming," the colonel said, his voice calm. "Please, come in and close the door." Eleanor did, the soft click of the latch sounding very loud. She walked to a spot in front of the desk, feeling like she was in a play where she didn't know her lines. "Sergeant Major," Colonel Griffin began, turning his gaze to the rigid man. "For the record, please recount for me your concerns regarding Dr. Vance's presence and conduct in the secure archive wing." Royce cleared his throat. The confident, gravelly voice from the hallway was gone, replaced by a tighter, more formal tone. He spoke about protocol, about the importance of security, about the need for constant vigilance. He mentioned the incident with the classified binder, stating that he had found it out of place after Dr. Vance had been unaccounted for. He carefully used official language, but the meaning was clear. He believed she was a risk. The colonel listened without interruption, his hands clasped behind his back. When Royce finished, the colonel gave a single slow nod. "I see." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. Then he turned his full attention to Eleanor. His eyes, a sharp blue, studied her not with suspicion, but with a deep, thoughtful curiosity. "Dr. Vance," he said, his tone shifting, becoming almost conversational. "The sergeant major has presented his perspective. Now, for the sake of clarity and completeness, would you please help us understand yours? For the record, could you please tell Sergeant Major Royce?" He paused, just for a heartbeat. "Your full title?" The question was so unexpected, so utterly simple, that for a second Eleanor didn't understand what he was asking. Her full title? Did he mean her Ph.D.? Her professorship? Then she saw the look in his eye. It wasn't a request for her university credentials. It was a quiet, knowing prompt. He had done his homework. A strange calm settled over her. The anxiety, the anger, the humiliation of the past 2 weeks melted away, replaced by a clear, cold certainty. She was no longer just the civilian in the wrong clothes. She straightened her posture. Not in a stiff military way, but with a natural, unthinking authority that came from a place she had kept closed for a long time. She looked directly at Sergeant Major Royce, who was now watching her. A faint line of confusion between his brows. "My name," she said, her voice clear and firm in the quiet room, "is Dr. Eleanor Vance, but in my official service records, I am listed as Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Vance, United States Army Reserve. Retired." The words fell into the silence like stones into a still pond. Royce's head jerked back as if he'd been physically pushed. All the color drained from his face, leaving it a waxy gray. His eyes, wide and disbelieving, darted from her face to the colonel's and back again. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The rigid, perfect posture he had held seemed to deflate by a fraction of an inch. He wasn't looking at a problematic civilian anymore. He was looking at a superior officer, a retired one, but a lieutenant colonel nonetheless. A rank far, far above his own. The math was terrible and instant in his mind. Every order he'd given her, every petty correction, every sarcastic, "Ma'am," all of it had been directed at an officer. He hadn't just been rude to a visitor. He had shown profound disrespect to the very chain of command he worshipped. Colonel Griffin watched the realization crush the sergeant major. There was no satisfaction on the colonel's face, only a firm, judicial gravity. He had not brought her here to embarrass Royce, but to correct a fundamental error in judgment, an error that had poisoned the environment for 2 weeks. The silence in the room was now absolute, thick with the weight of the revelation. The paintings of the old generals seemed to be watching. The only sound was the faint, distant cry of a command from the parade ground far below. Eleanor stood, waiting. The ball was no longer in her court. It had never truly been. It had always been in the colonel's, and he had just changed the entire game with a single, simple question. For a long moment, no one in the colonel's office moved or spoke. The words "Lieutenant Colonel" seemed to hang in the air, slowly sinking into the polished wood of the floor and the minds of the two men. Sergeant Major Royce looked as if the ground had vanished beneath his perfectly polished boots. His eyes, wide with a shock so deep it was almost physical, were fixed on Eleanor. But he wasn't seeing the woman in the cream blouse anymore. He was seeing a ghost of rank and respect he had failed utterly to recognize. The strict, rule-bound world he lived in had just turned inside out. The civilian he had harassed for not belonging had, in fact, belonged to the institution longer, and more deeply than he had ever known. His face was a mask of crumbling certainty. Colonel Griffin broke the silence. He didn't look at Royce. His focus was entirely on Eleanor. He took a deliberate step out from behind his desk. His movement was smooth, purposeful. He walked around to stand before her, the space between them charged with a new meaning. He stopped, his posture perfect, his shoulders square. He looked directly into her eyes, his own gaze holding a depth of understanding and a quiet apology. Then, with a precision that was both instinctual and deeply respectful, Colonel David Griffin, a full colonel, brought his right hand up in a crisp, formal, and flawless salute. It was not a quick gesture. It was held. The salute spoke a whole language of its own. It said, "I see you. I acknowledge your service. I apologize for the failure of one of my men to do the same. You are one of us." The air left Eleanor's lungs. The last 2 weeks, the locked doors, the loud repairs, the public accusations, all of it seemed to narrow to this single point. This wasn't about winning an argument or getting an apology. This was about restoration. The colonel wasn't just saluting the retired lieutenant colonel. He was saluting the person who had endured pettiness with quiet dignity. He was saluting her patience, her professionalism, and the history she had lived that Royce had been too blind to see. A lifetime of instinct, buried but never forgotten, took over. Her own spine straightened, not into the stiff posture of someone playing a part, but into the natural, easy alignment of someone returning to a familiar skin. Her shoulders went back, her chin level. The nervous historian vanished. In her place stood an officer. She brought her own hand up, returning the salute with equal crispness, her eyes locked on his. Her fingers were straight, her thumb tucked just right, the tip of her forefinger touching a spot just above her eyebrow where a uniform's brim would have been. It was a perfect, silent echo of his gesture. Time seemed to hold for the length of that salute. Then, in unison, both hands cut away, snapping back to their sides. "Welcome back to the fold, Lieutenant Colonel," Colonel Griffin said, his voice softer now, but still formal. The title, in his mouth, sounded like an honor. "Let's get you back to your work." He turned his head slightly, final.